The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. At that time, Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee, went up on the mountain, and sat down there. Great crowds came to him, having with them the lame, the blind, the deformed, the mute, and many others. They placed them at his feet, and he cured them. The crowds were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the deformed made whole, the lame walking, and the blind able to see, and they glorified the God of Israel. Jesus summoned his disciples and said, "My heart is moved with pity for the crowd, for they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, for fear they may collapse on the way." The disciples said to him, "Where could we ever get enough bread in this deserted place to satisfy such a crowd?" Jesus said to them, "How many loaves do you have?" "7," they replied, "and a few fish." He ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, gave thanks, broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples, who in turn gave them to the crowds. They all ate and were satisfied. They picked up the fragments left over, 7 baskets full. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. It's, of course, a story and a miracle, very rich with possible contents to talk about. Though I think the joke of the liturgical calendar in this case is that this is the 3rd weekday of Advent, and Christ says, "They've been with me now for 3 days." So we're supposed to feel like we need an encouragement. We need some new food. It's interesting the way that Christ operates here. First, he heals miraculously all kinds of people, the deformed, the lame, the blind, the mute. And this stuns everyone. And after this great display, there's then the question of lunch, something much simpler. People are just hungry, and they've been walking along for days to follow around the sea. When it comes to those simpler things, however, Christ, might say, delegates the responsibility. First, he addresses the disciples. He says, "My heart is moved with pity for the crowd, for they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. I don't want them to send them away hungry, for fear they may collapse on the way." He simply states this to the disciples, who then will say, "Well, where could we ever get enough food for this many people?" Once he, we might say, produces the food sufficient for these people, he has the disciples handed out to them. There's a way in which, for some reason, this handing out of that which is most necessary is given over to not Christ himself. I don't think it's just a practical question. One man by himself distributing is not as quick as a dozen. But something else is being told to us about how we are to receive the nourishment that we most need. It is nice to think that we would, perhaps like St. Paul, receive a direct vision of Christ to explain to us what's what and to change our lives, even if it meant blinding us temporarily. That we would encounter, through no intermediary, the reality that we seek. But most of us, that is not how it works. Most of us are given the food that we need through some other encounters, through some intermediary, apparently an intermediary, but sent in providence, perhaps, or for sure, by God. And maybe not just a single intermediary, but a whole set of circumstances and people and places and events. Often, we encounter this through hearing, but also through experiencing God's love for us in the reality in which we find ourselves. I focus on this aspect because of today's feast of St. Francis Xavier, someone who brought saving food to more people than almost anyone else in history, sort of the greatest missionary so far, after St. Paul, they say. Not perhaps numerically, though quite substantially, perhaps even numerically, tens or even hundreds of thousands of people that he affected. That we are granted the nourishment we need, sometimes through saints that we meet. Francis Xavier knew that himself, and I experienced that in my own life, actually through the figure of St. Francis Xavier, to bear the briefest witness to the influence the saints can have on one's life. Although I was baptized as a baby, was baptized in a Presbyterian church, and I was raised in an Episcopalian church, I didn't become Catholic till I was in college. When we think through the question of our conversion, those of us who are not just who are monks and religious, but all of us who are dedicated Christians can think, well, yes, I was baptized, but then there's usually at least a confirmation, and then usually after that, some further step, perhaps thousands of such steps, of entering more deeply into the real spiritual quest. For me, practically in many ways, it began with hearing about St. Francis Xavier. I remember it rather vividly. I was a sophomore in high school, and it was my world history teacher who took a day to explain to us, probably as a lesson on sort of early colonialism or something, right? But he was not interested in those dynamics as much in getting us to imagine vividly the life of St. Francis Xavier, someone born in Navarre, Spain, who then dies on an island just a few miles off the coast of China. It was a time in my life when I, as Christ says, it had been several days I've been wandering without food. I needed a lot. I had been very eagerly running away from any possible spiritual quest and willfully entangling myself in all kinds of intellectual and emotional and personal and all kinds of other sort of dark entanglements that weren't making me happy, but I sort of still nonetheless wanted to throw myself into. I don't think just because it made me seem cool to other people, but made me feel like I was living my little life. At that point, I could already drive. I could kind of wander around as I please. My parents blissfully inattentive to me, trusting in me, it turns out, which I was eager to abuse. I entered into a very dark part of my life and imagining what it would really mean to have a kind of mission at all or a purpose in life. I had lost it in some instinctive level, and in other ways gleefully tossed it aside as something threatening to my immediate sense of who I was and what I felt like doing. And I remember it was just some weekday, the teacher telling us about St. Francis Xavier, who went off to the ends of the earth, as he would imagine it, in the middle of the 16th century. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in history in Europe. This is the midst of the Reformation, especially as a Protestant young man at a Catholic school. It seemed like the main thing is to think about this issue over here. He said, well, yes, there's the Reformation happening in Europe. At the same time, there's this guy who goes to convert people in the various parts of Asia. And not just convert them, not sort of teach them a thing or two. I remember the teacher was a very vivid storyteller. And he was talking to us about St. Francis Xavier in Japan, ministering to the lepers, who so people who always have a difficult fate, especially in a very polite and cleanly society. And that rather than merely preaching to them, he was known to not just touch them, but to kiss their wounds, which are kind of pretty disgusting sorts of wounds, sort of oozing, that he would kiss the backs of the lepers because he couldn't quite speak their language, but he needed to communicate to them God's love for them. And that he's off doing this while people are busy arguing over certain points, killing each other over them in Europe in the wars of religion. And someone realized there is still something very beautiful to be done. Maybe realize, well, maybe I'm stuck in my own little world and I need to be called forth into something. I don't think I'm going to go kiss the lepers. We have medicine now for that. Then I learned more about St. Francis Xavier, but left me with the question, what am I supposed to be doing? I mean, kind of the first time I'd ever asked myself, once I was old enough to realize that my parents weren't going to really tell me. They couldn't tell me here's what your mission in life is to be, little Father Stephen. My teachers couldn't just tell me. It's not something that was available to them. It was something I needed to encounter. I needed to start wanting that encounter. St. Francis Xavier speaks about going into the various islands around India and into India itself, and then eventually also into Japan. And yeah, he would baptize the little babies and all this, but then the older children would flock to him, desperate to learn the Our Father, to learn how to sing the Apostles' Creed in their language, or even in Latin, to learn anything they could about this religion, this encountering of a real spiritual desire, which he found on the other side of the world, corresponding to his own eagerness. This something miraculous and beautiful happened in his bold mission. It made me think, well, I should actually be trying to figure out what to do with my life. It also made me encounter my own unhappiness, that though I was doing a lot of silly little things, and not entirely thoughtlessly. I mean, a lot of us do dumb things thoughtlessly all the time, but sometimes we actually we sort of decide it's okay to just waste our time doing this. We think it through. We don't want to think of a higher spiritual challenge, even though we're simultaneously unhappy with what we're doing. The puzzling thing about human beings. So St. Francis Xavier had also been through such significant soul searching. When he was very young, his family in Spain was literally ruined. I mean, the fortress, the castle was ruined to the ground by the kings of Castile because the father was on the wrong side of a war. The family was reduced to poverty. And St. Francis got up and left. As far as I know, I actually never really saw them again. Left his native Spain to go to the University of Paris, the coolest place he could find. But God had something in store for him. He lived in a boarding house in Paris, full of all kinds of typical badly behaved college boys. But on the hallway was a man named Peter Faber and this guy named Ignatius, who was a little bit older, Ignatius of Loyola, who'd already been through a lot of his own troubling experiences and had returned with a sense of spiritual ambition that had not yet landed in a concrete program. If you did think if that guy in her freshman hallway turned out to be the next St. Ignatius. It's a great good fortune. Also kind of a nightmare, in the first few years. St. Francis Xavier was one of these people that St. Ignatius and St. Peter Faber discerned wanted something more, but was going to need a lot of work to get there. Francis Xavier is one of the first people with whom Ignatius shared his spiritual ambitions, which he had kept very much to himself. But it was hard for Francis Xavier. Peter Faber came along very quickly. He was kind of the first to go on an Ignatian retreat and join up in the new idea of the Society of Jesus. They couldn't quite get Francis Xavier to come along. For one thing, he had gotten himself wrapped up in a variety of, let's just say, rather questionable relationships. Sort of like St. Augustine. It's like, well, he knows that this is not a great thing, it's kind of questionable, but it's still hard to get out of. And there was also, of course, this is the time of the Protestant Reformation. There was a very real sense in which the spirit of Calvinism was entering into Paris, and that was kind of the exciting, cool thing. And Francis Xavier preferred the exciting and the cool. So he resisted going on one of these retreats. Instead, finished his degree in philosophy and began as a professor of philosophy. He wanted to be a renowned professor of philosophy, drawing big audiences for sort of worldly acclaim. But a kind of worldly acclaim, and I guess you could be a philosopher with worldly acclaim in those days. It seems like a good thing to be doing, teaching Aristotelian logic and sort of working to kind of give better foundations for theology, perhaps, and is a faithful person to a degree. But still, in a way, serving his own life. And Ignatius, who was a brilliant reader of souls, saw this guy will still not be happy with this. This is not God's will for this person, though Ignatius didn't always have just a vision of what God's will was for you. But he could see that it wasn't that. Some people, it's easy to read their unhappiness. Even if they're sort of acting giddy, they're involved in things that seem to be fun to them. It's easy to see, like, in their eyes, if they give you a second, which not all people do, to look them in the eyes, you sort of see that person needs something more. So Ignatius thought, I know what I'll do. I got to work at this guy from the inside. So rather than coming and saying, well, Francis, you're being an idiot, and you got to abandon this philosophy stuff and change your life and come follow me and do this or that, he started sending students to Francis's classes. So, well, if you want to be a big philosopher, well, I'll find good people to be philosophy students for you. And this is what showed Francis Xavier, oh, that guy actually, who's Ignatius, a rather intense man from all reports, this kind of limping former soldier. He realized he actually is a friend to me. And that is what opened Francis Xavier to go on a sort of 30-day retreat with Ignatius and eventually join up among those first people, and in a way to become the greatest Jesuit that there has been. He wrote in a letter back, at this point he's already in Goa or in India or in parts of Malaysia. He writes a letter back to his Jesuit companions after various other adventures. And we read this every morning on his feast day. Here's what he says. I find it always very challenging as those of us who live in a university life. He says, again and again, I have thought of going around the universities of Europe, especially Paris, so his own alma mater, and everywhere crying out like a madman, riveting the attention of those with more learning than charity. And here is what I would say. What a tragedy. How many souls are being shut out of heaven and falling into hell thanks to you. I wish they would work as hard at this as they do at their books, and so settle their account with God for their learning and the talents entrusted to them. That's kind of the first step of his little outcry. I think it's a rather obvious one, but a good one to hear. These people in Paris are debating little issues that aren't even solving the question of the Reformation, when there is a world to be converted. But then he continues, this thought, that there is an accounting for the learning and the gifts, this thought would certainly stir most of them to meditate on spiritual realities, to listen actively to what God is saying to them. They would forget their own desires, their human affairs, and give themselves over entirely to God's will and his choice. They would cry out with all their heart, Lord, I'm here. What do you want me to do? Send me anywhere you like. And he concludes, even to India, which is where he's writing from. How do we make someone or give rise to the moment in someone's life when spiritual realities will dawn on them and they will begin to listen actively to what God is saying to them, to put themselves before the Lord and say, I'm here, what do you want me to do? That is a hard thing to recreate. You can teach the Iliad to freshmen. You can't always make it impact their lives this way. Now, St. Francis Xavier was not just someone rushing off to convert as many people as possible. He was someone trying to listen actively to what God was saying through the influence of a college friend, St. Ignatius of Loyola, He began to do that. Even in India, when he was wondering what direction to go in this completely new land, he spent 4 months at the tomb of St. Thomas there in Chennai, where it's held to be, praying daily for illumination of which direction to go. Praying at the tomb of St. Thomas, who had touched the very wounds of Christ, and who himself had been, as it seems in the gospel, a little hesitant to believe. It's a great example for us to hear, to remember that it's not that, we need to rush off and be missionaries across the world tomorrow. We need to begin listening actively to what God is saying through our own desires, through the needs of those around us, through this life that we are in. Remember that Christ, who here multiplied the loaves in the gospel, he began by saying, "My heart is moved with pity for the crowd, for fear they may collapse on the way." A lot of us around here nowadays are pretty tired, mentally, physically, spiritually. But the Christ who invited you here, who invites you here, is moved with pity for fear that you collapse. That face of Christ that looked on that crowd is the face that still looks upon you. That pitying heart is the heart that wants to feed you. Through the hands of this day that you're in, this life that you're in. There may be a St. Ignatius around you trying to find a way into your soul to get you to realize that you're not paying attention to what matters. You may be the St. Ignatius for someone else. St. Francis Xavier is not just getting away from a series of problems, he was running toward Christ. For him, Christ was as far away from Paris as he could get. For him, it was in the Indies. For St. Philip Neri, who was a friend of St. Francis Xavier's for a brief time, and Ignatius in Rome, who thought he wanted to follow Francis Xavier and go off to India, for him it was just exactly where he already was. In this Advent, we are all running toward Christ. Remember that Christ is looking to you, to draw himself to you, to nourish you in that journey, in this sacrament that we celebrate, and in the life that you have been given.